All right, we've been looking the past few weeks, though, because of Passover being last week, at something one of my textbook authors had mentioned, crucial moments in biblical history. And I asked you, what would you say? And I got a good round of acceptance from a lot of people. These are moments when it seemed impossible, and God responded in a way that was not even imaginable. And of course, it had to deal with sin. Salvation is always spoken of in the scriptures as a rescue. We are prisoners of war. And God came to the rescue, paid the price for us to leave. And don't think for a moment that he paid Satan to set us free. Satan does not own anything. Satan is not in charge of anything. Hell was designed for him and his angels. Humans have no business being there. The rescue, the rescue price that was paid to God. God was the one who was offended. God was the one who enacts justice. And God was the one who paid his own price so that we could go free. These are crucial moments in biblical history. He mentioned this, Anderson mentioned three. One was the Passover. And that really culminated in the Exodus story. Exodus, not just the book of Exodus. The Exodus took Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Why were the Israelites in Egypt to begin with? Well, they were in slavery after they had gotten there. How did they get there? Okay, it started with the story of Joseph. His brothers wanted to kill him. One of them spoke up for him and said, hey, wait. Maybe we could get some money out of this, after they saw the slave traders passing by. So they sold him as a slave, even though he was kicking and screaming the whole time. They had no mercy. And then, of course, he did the best he could with what he had and rose to prominence. He was able to interpret dreams, which the hierarchy in Egypt believed were messages from God. And in the cases here with Joseph, they really were. Joseph not only interpreted a dream that could not be done by human means, he gave a solution. And just like at work, if you have an idea and know how it should be done, guess who gets the job? But Joseph took it and ran with it. And then who came during a famine to ask for help? The brothers. Oh my goodness. Would you have been able to do that? I like reading the story because Joseph did what he could to actually tease him and play with him.
Yeah. Am I wrong? Didn't he tell his brothers he had a dream or something?
Yeah.
He would roll over?
Yeah.
That really made him happy.
Oh, man. Yeah. Because, okay, Joseph was the firstborn son of Rachel, whom, as I see it, Jacob considered to be his real wife, because he worked for his uncle to have Rachel. And they must have looked quite a bit alike, because in the morning after the wedding, oh, behold, it was Leah. Can you imagine? The fright and the fear. He'd been tricked. But the name Jacob was duly applied to him. When he was born, he was holding his brother's foot, wasn't he? Hey, get back here. And he was named, and I have to apologize to the ladies who named their sons Jacob. But Jacob means a trickster, a con man. He was adequately named. He, with his mother's instigation, stole what was known as the birthright. Thing is, back then when they made a commitment, verbal commitment, witnesses, you could not break it. The Hebrew word is translated into English as adultery. We have a far different meaning than what the Hebrew is. Because when it mentions adultery in the Bible, even in the Ten Commandments, it's not talking about a sexual act. There's no sexual inference at all to adultery. To adultery is you made a promise, you signed on the line, witnesses knew it, people heard it, and then you didn't do it. And God says, you don't do that. When you promise, it doesn't matter how bad you get it afterwards, or how much you lose, or you're not happy. You do not go back on your word. And that's basically what happened there. Anyway, moving on. Here come Joseph's brothers, and he plays with them because he's painted like the Egyptians. He looked like an Egyptian, but he knew what they were saying. He knew their language, and he played with them until they begged. And then he revealed it to them, and of course they had heart attacks, didn't they? But Joseph brought them to Egypt to take care of them because the famine was going to be severe for a long time. Once they were there, they settled in and they stayed. Unfortunately for them, a Pharaoh came to the throne with a different dynasty. These were Phoenicians that came down the coast into northern Africa. They were not Africans. The Egyptians were not African by race. They were Phoenicians who settled in the continent of Africa because of the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta. And another dynasty had come in and conquered them. What they would do is try to erase all of the past history. That's why the Sphinx has a broken nose, and the pyramids were broken into and ransacked. That's because they're trying to destroy that history. And here are some people from the area of the former dynasty who are squatters on our land. And so they dealt shrewdly with them. They probably said, now you owe us to stay here. Otherwise you're going to have to leave. And they forced them into servitude. And it turned into abject slavery. 400 some years. And by the time the Exodus happened, they were looking for relief but could not imagine how it would happen. How do you get away from the most powerful nation that known to man at the time? How do you do it? Only death. It was their only thought. God, with 10 plagues, he says in the prophets, each of those plagues was aimed at one of the nature gods that the Egyptians worshipped. Because it was believed that if a nation was faithful enough to their gods, or God, he was powerful enough to help them overcome other nations and their gods. And that does come up in Israel's history, where Sennacherib from Assyria was laying siege, but Judah was a side note. I don't want to bother with them. Just sue for peace. And the guy says, now, what other gods have conquered our God? Do you think you're going to get away? See, that was their feeling. Now, the 10 plagues showed that this nameless God, who favored these squatters, these trespassers, the Egyptians could do nothing. In fact, by about the third plague, Pharaoh's advisors were saying, let him go, let him get out of here. It's not worth it. He was so stubborn, he waited out 10. Do you know why 10? This all comes up in Revelation, too, with the symbolism. How many fingers you got when you hold up both hands? 10. And in the Hebrew mindset, symbolism is, that's complete. Think of a circle, no ends. Complete cycle, 10. 12 is just taking that one step further. There's nothing, the epitome of something that is complete was symbolized with the number 12. 3 was the number for God. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's easy to remember. 4 represented man and the created universe, north, south, east, and west. So those are, easy things. Now you put those two together, how many you got? You got God and man together as salvation. 7. So those are all symbolic numbers. So he had to have a Pharaoh on the throne who would wait out 10 plagues. Talk about stubborn. The 10th plague was following the Passover. The Passover, they were to kill a lamb at twilight, spread the blood on the doorposts of their house. Inside the house, in a family unit, they were to eat that lamb, make it a part of them. And in the night, then, the death angel passed over. How did the Egyptians respond to that? Did Pharaoh give in then? That much. The people paid the Israelites to leave. Get out of here. Here, take this with you. And I always see that as severance pay for 400 some years of service. And they got out into the wilderness and right up against the Red Sea. Oh, I guess we're going to camp here. How do we get it? No bridge. And coming behind them, Pharaoh had changed his mind. So God, through the night, had a wind to blow back the waters. Be honest. Would you be the first one to go through there? Oh, no. I'd put about 10 big guys ahead of me like I did in the football when I was running back. So, yeah, I'm behind you all the way, guys. I got an Egyptian army behind me. Let's go, guys. And then the water closed up on them. Who gets all the credit for that? Because what did the Israelites do? They painted and they ate. And they walked through a scary, scary place, the valley of the shadow of death. Who did it all? God did it all. And that's why we're not saved by works. See, all of this is not, the Old Testament was not given to us so that we would have Bible class material for the kids. These stories that we teach, call them children's stories. They were very adult lessons. Who gets all the credit? What do we really do? Does God need us? Do we have to defend him? Do we have to stand up for him? He's already done everything that needs to be done. He's conquered already. How do you help a conqueror? It's by falling in line and doing things their way. That's what the Exodus showed. Because they got into a wilderness land that I'm tired of living like a camper right now. I can't imagine. God forget they needed to drink? Water from a rock. Did he forget they needed to eat? Picked it up off the ground. My mom said it didn't grow on trees. And then when they got tired of the manna, and the Hebrew word for manna, what is it? That's what it meant. What is this stuff? And then he sent quail through the camp. They just reached up and grabbed one. Now, who did all that? He was the cloud shielding them from the sun during the day. He was fire and night light, warmth at night. All they had to do was just follow the shepherd. How did it work out? The moment Moses left them for a period of time, they wanted to go back to slavery. That's the whole story of the Exodus. Are they not like us? Are we not like them? Paul had to point that out in the letter to the Romans. You who claim to be Jews, are you any different than the Gentiles? You're the same. And it's been thousands of years later, and how are we today in the church? We're the same. Can't stay at it much longer. We gotta go back to Egypt. Yeah, the good old days. Remember those? Were they really the good old days? I mean, back in the good old days when Mom talked about the good old days, I did a report in my history class. We had to interview someone who had been through the Depression. So I went over to Grandma Ellen's house. And she would talk about when they were children, and how they would, farm the land and build up mounds and put their produce in there, like apples and stuff, to keep them preserved and stuff. And she smiled about how they made their own soap and all this stuff. And one question we had to ask at the very end was Grandma, were those really the good old days? Her face changed completely. No! We almost starved to death! But yet we always look back to the good old days, don't we? They weren't that good. Yeah, so, and we also, every generation thinks it can't get much worse. It can. Yes, it can. So the Exodus was a foreshadowing of Jesus' redemption. We are enslaved to sin. We can see no way out. God himself comes to the rescue, shows his power over any other thing that we think is an obstacle to us. We're in the wilderness, and it's not a nice place. And we want to go back to Egypt. How many who left that day, who left Egypt, how many made it to Canaan? Joshua and Caleb. Wait a second, where's Moses? Not even Moses made it. His patience was his worst enemy. Yeah. Aaron didn't make it. He decided to listen to the crowd. Yeah. See, it's the same way. Two old geezers, Joshua and Caleb, were the only ones who made it. And then we have going into the next crucial moment in biblical history, and that's what I left for you today. Oh, also, part of the law of Moses we usually think is just the Ten Commandments, but there was a lot more to the law of Moses than the Ten Commandments. In fact, Jesus, when asked which of the commandments was the greatest, which of the 10 did he list? I can't do 10 and now you give me 2 more? Thanks a lot. But if we have love, that was one commandment Jesus gave to his disciples. You were right. You love each other the way I have loved you. That's the only commandment he gave them. We make up a whole bunch of other lists of commandments, don't we? And we think God's going to be happy if we do them. But in the end, then, who gets the credit for that? We're not going to be able to claim any credit. That's why Paul says we're saved by the grace of God. And it's on the basis of our faith. And faith doesn't mean just believe. Believe is a beginning. But faith then is the inner commitment, and then the doing it, living it out. Failing, yes. Thankfully, Christ's blood continues to cleanse us. We get back up, we dust ourselves off, and we keep going. And it doesn't look like we're going to get out of here alive, does it? Well, that's what happened then with the next crucial moment in biblical history. Today, the exile. How many of you studied the exile? It's a good study. It's a lot of reading, though. Because it's actually discussed, the beginnings of it discussed like on your handout here. Galatians chapter 3, let's look at that for a second. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the Galatians who were saved by Christ, but then went back to a system of rules. And I've heard people today say that they are a legalist because I follow the law of Christ. No, the law of Christ is the grace of God on the basis of your faith. That's his law. They want to follow rules and think they're making God happy. But no one can keep the rules. You fail one time at the rules, it's over. That's the problem with rules. And here's what Paul says here in Galatians chapter 3, starting in verse 19. What then was the purpose of law? The word the, T-H-E, is not in these paragraphs. He's not talking about a specific law, usually interpreted as the law of Moses. The law of Moses was just one of the laws people followed. It was added because of transgressions until the seed to whom the promise referred to had come. The seed of Abraham, through your seed, through your descendant, all nations will be blessed. That promise never got sidetracked, never a plan B. It was always one descendant of Abraham. And who was that?
Isaac.
Well, he had his son. But who was going to be the descendant who blessed all nations? Jesus. Just one. So you see, even all throughout the Old Testament scriptures, it's all about Jesus. All about his rescue. Just one. Okay? The law was put in place to show us you can't earn it. You can't do it. Even the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 7, present tense verbs, is still failing with sin. Who's going to rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Christ Jesus. The one descendant that God was looking to. The law was a teacher to show you that you can't earn it. You can't earn it by attendance. You can't earn it by not cussing and swearing. You can only earn it by the grace of God as a gift. All right. It was added because of transgression until the seed to whom it was promised had come. The law was put into effect through angels by a mediator. Well, this time it is the law, Moses. A mediator, however, does not represent just one party, but God is one. Is the law therefore opposed to the promises of God? Absolutely not. For if a law had been given that would impart life, then righteousness would certainly have come by law. But the scripture declares that the whole world is a prisoner of sin, so that what was promised, being given through faith in Jesus Christ, might be given to those who faith. Doesn't make sense in English, does it? Because faith isn't a verb. But in Hebrew and Greek it is. Those who faith, they act it out. They act out their belief and their commitment. Before this faith came, we were held prisoners by law, locked up until faith should be revealed. When Jesus came, Peter was pronounced the rock because of his statement of faith. That's what Jesus built his church on. So the law was put in charge to lead us where? To Christ. So we can't abandon it. Jesus did not come to abolish it. Everything it talks about him. It was preparation for him. And now that faith has come, we are no longer under the supervision of law. We shouldn't have to prove it to ourselves and everybody else. Because God does not look at the outward appearance, does he? Looks at the heart. This is all played out in this period of the exile. I'll try to go through here quick. There's a lot of history here. It's good history, but it will take you a while to get through it. Look at all the books that the exile is discussed in. 2 books of the Kings, 2 books of the Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and in the prophets in Jeremiah. And then he wrote the Lamentation while he watched God's punishment unfold. He sat on the hillside. A lament means you're past the point of crying in your sadness. You got to pour out your soul just to get some understanding of it. And it's in the Lamentation, my favorite verse. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Yet what else do we have to hold on to? His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Therefore, I will trust in him. That comes from the Lamentation. Prophet Ezekiel, Daniel, and many of the minor prophets. Minor, not because they're less important, but because they're shorter. Major prophets were prophets for most of their life. Minor prophets, just one call, and they're done. That's what made a major or minor. Okay. Background, though. The kingdom was actually united under God. Yeah, our nation tries to use that phrase, but it really isn't there, is it? In practice. One nation under God? Now, you try to talk religion in Washington, D.C., you're going to get escorted out. Yeah. In the books of Samuel, God calls Samuel at a very young age to be a judge. Later on, he became a prophet. That was the transition from judge to prophet. And a judge was not sitting there in court listening to cases. Judges brought about God's judgment. They brought the punishment that was needed or the reward that was earned. And there wasn't many rewards during the time of the judges. When there was a threat to one territory, they called out their brothers to help them. You're out hoeing the peas one day. You got to get this done because it's going to rain. And all of a sudden, here comes, we got to go help tribe of Judah again. Can you get tired of that real easy? Well, the people got tired of it too. And it's because of a human tendency toward trying to make life easier. We want things comfortable for us. I know that feeling now. I would like some comforts and niceties of life. I can understand this. The people grew impatient. Samuel, you're getting old and your sons aren't acting like you now. What'd they want? They wanted their own worst enemy. They wanted a king to be like everybody else. Well, you become a king, he's going to take your sons and they're going to go to war and they're going to get killed and there's going to be devastation. And give us a king now. But it was basically because Samuel himself, a human, was not a real good father. His boys were not only corrupt and immoral, they had worn out their welcome. They did not want one of them taking over. So God chose Saul, who was reluctant at first, but the power went to his head. So God's person wasn't ready yet, but they couldn't wait. So God says, I'll give him a king. He stood head and shoulders above everybody else. Saul was a big dude, and he was strong, and we would vote for him for president. But the power went to his head, and he literally went insane. So God then rejected him as king because his guy was at least born now. So he sent Samuel to the house of Jesse to anoint the next king. And all 7 boys come before him. God said, no, don't look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. This is a different kind of king. All 7. Okay, go to Jesse's house. Anoint one of his sons. God said, no. You got another boy? What else could it be? Yeah, the runt. He's out with the sheep. Well, you better bring him in. We better check this out. As soon as he crossed the threshold, God said, that's a guy. And he anointed him in front of his brothers. How would they feel about that? Are we going back to the time of Joseph again? See how these things just keep playing out? And then Saul actually hires David to play music for him, to soothe the evil spirit. And then he finds out who the better man really is. Twice he tries to kill him. You see what power does to you when it's not tempered by the word of God. And David ran away from Saul. Twice he refused to kill him. He had him right in his hands, but he refused to touch God's anointed one. That's how faithful he was to God. That's why he was the standard that all other kings are judged by, even though he was far from perfect himself. Eventually, Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in battle. That destroyed the family line. They were ready for a new dynasty. House of Judah anointed David as their king. 7 years later, the rest of Israelites, the rest of the tribes, brought him on as king too. It was just easier than trying to find their own. Again, what's easiest for me? They never really did cohere. Did you know there was a civil war among the Israelites? It was someone who brought it up to my attention. He was in our recovery group. He said, "Why is Israel fighting against Israel?" And oh yeah, I remembered the time period following David's reign. Anyway, he desired to build God a temple, a house. God kind of laughed about it. Yeah, it's kind of a funny joke how your kid brings up these things. Really, what kind of house can hold me? But he said, no, I'm going to make you a house. And that was the promise to David that his descendant would be Messiah. And David did everything but build the temple. He designed it. He got the work crews together. He bought the materials. All Solomon had to do was just say the word, and they just put it together. No tools were heard on the work site till it was done. And just before he died, he commanded his officials to anoint Solomon because Solomon was not the oldest son. God never does things the way we expect him to, does he? That makes him a very dangerous God to follow because you never know what's coming next. Solomon just asked for wisdom. God appreciated that. But his wisdom became his God. Yeah, he's best known for building and dedicating the service of God's temple. But in order to expand the kingdom, he made marriage alliances with the other nations around. Now that they got family there, they're not going to attack him. He built it all through commerce. And the economy was enormous. Silver, to them, was treated like how we treat pennies. They said they just saw silver ingots as just rocks. I'll take some of those rocks. The other nations, yeah, I'll take it, sure. Yeah, and everybody else living the high life. But that's when the people then became complacent. Just like when they wanted a king, they wanted a king who would go out and fight their battles for them. They didn't want to be called out to fight anymore. And they grew fat and lazy.
To the people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, David's mentioned so much. Of course, through him, Jesus came. But he killed a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why I don't think his spiritual wisdom moved a lot of people. He was killing he killed more people than anybody else. Responsible for it, not him personally.
Very possibly, because he and his band used to raid Philistine towns.
So
He pretended to be with the Philistines, and unfortunately, they're still fighting over there today.
So they looked at him as strength.
Because God was with him. When he wanted to build the temple, Nathan the prophet didn't even ask God. He said, go ahead, God does everything you want anyway. God sent him back. No. Tell him this time, no. And David actually liked God's idea better. Okay, a lasting dynasty forever? Sure, okay, I'll take that. I'll let somebody else build it. Yeah, but he would go and massacre whole towns, secretly, not allowing any to escape, and hiding the evidence. And God did not direct him to do that. They were nations that were not faithful to God, and that God had declared during the time of the judges, they will not stand long before me. And that was how he enacted God's judgment then. He acted like a judge. But it was still, he didn't ask permission to do that. Yeah. He was a vicious person. If you crossed him, You didn't last.
And yet you take from
Uriah, yeah.
You take from when he wouldn't touch Saul.
Mm-hmm.
Saul was trying to kill him, and he still had every opportunity. Like I said twice, he had an opportunity.
Yeah, he was super zealous for Yahweh. So anybody who set themselves up as an enemy to Yahweh was his enemy. And the Hittites, Uriah was one of those nations supposed to eliminate. So taking his wife and having him killed was whatever. One less Hittite. But that's the one God said. He did everything I told him to. Well, except for Uriah the Hittite. We would right away in our British background, prim and proper, would say the adultery with Bathsheba. It doesn't say that. In fact, Bathsheba, it was her descendant who became Messiah. Matthew couldn't even bring himself in the genealogy to mention her name. That's just not the God we serve, is it? Yeah. Our God is dangerous. You just never know what he's going to do. Yeah. And that's what all these stories, that's why they're not for children. The cartoons that we used to watch on Saturday morning were not children's cartoons, were they? They were very adult jokes. They were actually shown in previews to the movies, to the speakies. That's where they started. Why they collected them, put them on TV, and put them before the children, who knows? These children wouldn't get the jokes. That's how these stories are. We tend to think of them as children's stories. They are extremely adult, and we miss the point, especially when we think it doesn't matter. We don't need to know this stuff. Anyway, Solomon made a lot of alliances with Canaanite women, and part of that, happy wife, happy life. Why don't they ever say anything about the husband being happy? They led him into idolatry, or to at least accept it, because as it says in 1 Kings, his heart was not fully devoted to God like David's was. And I think he wrote Ecclesiastes in hindsight. His son, it was written to his son, listen to my words. Don't listen to the women who say, come on, let's have some fun. Don't be a fool. I think he's looking at it in hindsight. The only thing that matters in Ecclesiastes, he says, is to fear God and keep his commandments. And he found out firsthand how true that was. But it was due to Solomon's idolatry. Because once you open Pandora's box, it does not close up. It's like trying to herd 3 cats into a box. Good luck. His son Rehoboam was not the wise man he wrote about. His son Rehoboam was the fool who listened to advisors his own age and wanted to tax heavy the people. He's going to raise revenues. 10 tribes to the north who never did really adhere said, see ya. And they broke away. God stopped him from trying to stop them because he had prophesied it to Solomon beforehand. So the 10 northern tribes formed the nation of Israel, called Israel. And they set up idolatry right away and never turned away from it. None of the kings, many, many dynasties and families, none of the kings were faithful to Yahweh. That's when the role of the prophet or the seer became prophet. 2 most important ones who never wrote a book, Elijah and Elisha. Elijah is going to come back and usher in the time of Messiah because he never died. God took him home in a glowing chariot, glowing limousine. He sent his limousine for Elijah, took him home. And then John the Baptist was the fulfillment of that. All right. They were eventually conquered by Assyria, the worst nation to be conquered by, 722 BC. They were extremely vicious to people. And we'll have to quit here, but just do a little report, a little study on the Assyrians. If you were not of their background, if you did not worship their gods, you did not deserve to live, and you did not deserve to be executed in a nice way. They were the ones who came up with the original form of crucifixion. And it was meant to torture a person till the last moment of life. Yeah, all of that, who does that remind you of? How are we eventually going to escape sin in our life today? Another great escape brought about by a crucifixion. Someone who died in our place, suffered a torturous death. And then due to intermingling, I'll go back to that. I'll make a note to start there next week. Due to intermarriages, because of what the Assyrians did, the race eventually died out. No one of the 10 northern tribes could trace their lineage after a period of time. That's not the end of the exile. That's just the beginning birth pangs of it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that then next week.